it was Koop because, of course, Koop was very close to Barnhouse. And it was,
Absolutely.
Barnhouse, first radio preacher in the US, 928 and so on. And it was through Barnhouse he was converted.
Yeah.
And back in the late 50s, late 40s, through the 50s, he was very close to Barnhouse, very
Yeah.
influential. Barnhouse died in 1960.
Yeah.
And I don't think Koop ever met the eldest daughter, Ruth. He met some of the younger Barnhouse children. But
Yeah.
that's how I discovered Ruth as Sylvia Plath's psychiatrist.
That's great.
One of the four amazing Barnhouse kids, homeschooled, long story by that, a lot of fun about it,
Yeah.
homeschooled by their granny, whom I discovered from reading the archives. The granny was in love with Barnhouse, her son-in-law. I mean, there's all sorts of fun. This is a telenovela.
Yeah, that's great.
Part of the story. Anyway, so that's what I'm doing.
Excellent. Well, listen, let me introduce you properly here.
Yep.
Because we need to get on with our podcasting part of this. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer. And my guest today is Nigel Cameron. And Nigel interviewed me, how long ago, Nigel?
For the book? Two and a half years.
Yeah, 2.5 years. It seems like yesterday. I couldn't, if you told me it was a month ago, I'd believe you, or 10 years ago time,
Good chat.
Nigel Cameron has written a book on Dr. Koop, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute, The Many Lives of the Surgeon General. Here's the book. It just came out 3 days ago in the States. I think University of Massachusetts is the press. And there's a couple chapters in here that talk about my dad, Francis Schaeffer, and I, because our involvement with Koop in the 70s and the 80s and the beginning of the Protestant part of the anti-abortion movement in the United States and so forth. So Nigel is a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa's Institute for Science and Society and Policy, and he is the author of Dr. Koop, The Many Lives of the Surgeon General. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Please subscribe right now on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts. My Substack, it has to be said, is a commentary, and that is at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And I just want to mention before we get going here that I talked to Ernie and asked him to include Dr. Koop, The Many Lives of the Surgeon General in our book club. We have a book club called It Has to Be Read, and it's our July selection. We would make it sooner because the book's out now, but that's our first opening. So let me introduce this book in an odd way. It isn't usual that the first I hear of a book is when an author calls me to interview me about his subject. And his subject is not me, but Dr. Koop and my dad and I all intersected actually over a lifetime. As you point out in the book, Dr. Koop and my father, Francis Schaeffer, were friends before I was born. And our family met when he helped with a medical issue with my sister. And then after I had polio, he advised my parents. And then years later, we reconnected after he had become involved with the anti-abortion movement, not so much from a theological point of view, but a medical one, as you point out in the book quite rightly. And then he came and talked to me in a Swiss chalet in L'Abri Fellowship, Switzerland, that was my parents' ministry in the 1970s, and said, look, the next film project you and your father ought to do after the one you did on art and culture called How Should We Then Live should be on the issue of abortion, which we touched on in How Should We Then Live, but it wasn't about that. He and I spent an evening together, and then he stayed for a few days, and by the time he left, he had roughed out with me a kind of a script proposal that I then presented to my dad, and then we made this film series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, which then played a big part in getting a lot of evangelical Protestants politicized when it came to this issue. And in fact, it became a kind of a litmus test that survives to this day as part of the religious right. So my introduction to the book is going to be odd in the sense that because I know Dr. Koop very well, and he remained a friend for my whole, adult life after I met him in my 20s, when you read a book that is about someone you know, and you're mentioned in it quite a bit, which I am, and your father is, of course, you judge the rest of the content based on what you know well. It's like having someone describe the neighborhood where you grew up. If they get the details right, you'll trust their descriptions on other things. And a lot has been written about my dad. A lot's been written about Koop. A lot has been written about me, or at least my involvement in the pro-life movement. And I've never read a more accurate description, faithful to the facts as I know them. So this book comes with my highest recommendation on two levels. First of all, this is an important part of American history, literally ripped from the headlines, because without what happens in Dr. Koop, The Many Lives of the Surgeon General, Donald Trump is not president today. Because without what happened here, the rise of the religious right, then becoming the MAGA movement, then the Republican Party becoming this great powerhouse behind this one figure, which they idealize, is not possible. You take this story out of American history and you don't have Donald Trump for president. You take this story out of American history and you can't understand why so many evangelicals voted for this guy. People ask, how could this be? Well, this is the book about it, because this is the book that explains how the evangelical wing of the pro-life movement started, because without Dr. Koop, it doesn't start. So that's a long, weird introduction, but I can't help but set it up that way because, as I say, I interview a lot of authors. I'm not in their books most of the time. So first of all, I just want to thank you personally, seriously, for having so faithfully written about someone that is very dear to me, and that's Dr. Koop, on one hand, and on the other hand, having quoted what I told you completely accurately, faithful to what I know, and having presented every fact in this book that I am aware of personally with absolute historical accuracy. So that's high praise. It's a very readable book as well, beautifully written, very interesting, and you certainly captured the man I knew.
Well, thank you, Frank. And, I knew him too. And I'm very glad we were able to connect and that you were able to help me a lot put the story together.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, one last footnote, this is a story that hasn't been told enough in the sense that, a surgeon general doesn't seem that important, but he was he was like a hinge in American history. After Koop, it's a completely different situation. And I can remember when he was down and the Senate hearings were going on for his confirmation as Surgeon General, how vitrolic they became. And he would get on the phone with me in the evenings and tell me what Senator Ted Kennedy had said publicly, and then privately saying, hey, this is just business. Don't pay any attention. I'm sorry I'm coming off as so harsh. So it was one of my windows into how things happen. So the first thing I want to ask you about the book, and then we'll get into the details of what you wrote, is tell me about your relationship with Dr. Koop, how that came about, and then how this book came about, the sort of two stories, how one follows the other.
Okay, well, how long do we have?
As long as you want.
So back in the 80s, 1980s, when we were all a bit younger, I was in Edinburgh in Scotland, and I was running a project, an independent project on basically ethics, religions, sort of issues. And I was setting up lectures on bioethics, medical ethics, as we were still calling it back then. And of course, Koop had been very famous as the world's leading pediatric surgeon, and for his fight over in the administration what was called baby doe, which was basically whether handicapped babies should be allowed to live, should be treated. And this is something he'd done a lot of work on back when he was a pediatric surgeon. And in a rather peculiar way, he becomes Surgeon General and has to deal with, again, from a policy point of view. So this had been in the news. And I vaguely heard of the guy. That was my sort of connection with him. And so I just wrote him a little letter, back in airmail paper, the old days, the little things we used to write on skinny paper. And it took me half an hour, can you come over and give us a lecture? And I thought, well, the answer will be no, but. And this was in 1985, and I get a call. Hey, this is Koop. And he says, the government owes me some vacation time and this and that. And so in the end, just over a year later, he came over and he spent just over a week with us in the UK, and I set up various lectures and conferences, some religious stuff. He lectures in some medical schools. There was a range of things. And we became friends. And I'll tell you what happened. Basically, so he goes back, great speaker, off he goes. And I send him a letter with a check for his expenses. And he writes back with a check for $100. And he says, Betty and I want to take you guys out for pizza. Because back then,
sure,
I had little kids. and he'd met the little kid. Anyway, so, and that was the beginning of a friendship.
Nice.
And we then moved to the States in 91. And he opened doors and this, that, and the other. And so for almost 30 years, we were friends. And I went to his 90th birthday party. I last saw him maybe 3 or 4 years before he died. I found an excuse to fly up to Hanover and have lunch. And he had on a new bow tie, of course, as he would.
Yeah.
So that's that. And so just before COVID, BC, before COVID, our lives were all changed back when COVID started. Somehow he popped into my head. I mean, he passed in 2013. And, I hadn't thought much about it. People slip out of your mind. But something reminded me of him back in, I suppose it was 2020. And I thought, well, I'm sure someone's written a biography. Wouldn't that be interesting? So I began to Google. Makes everything so simple these days. And nothing at all. I mean, seriously, nothing. When he passed, there were all these huge obituaries. And then absolute silence. And so, of course, people writing biographies can do it for years. I mean, you could spend a decade writing a biography.
Sure.
So I thought, who would know? I mean, who would be the person most likely to have been contacted by somebody who was writing about it? Because I began to think, well, maybe I should do this. I mean, I'm retired, right? And so I dropped an email to Tony Fauci, who was then kind of famous, but of course now he's uber famous. And back then, being the workaholic that he is, what is he now, 83, 84, he's finally retired, he was still doing his own email.
Yeah.
Just 2-3 months later, COVID broke, and I would probably never have got through to him. But he says, oh, yeah, because I'd met Fauci in the past. I knew he'd been very friendly with Koop. We talked about Koop. And he said, nobody has spoken to me about a biography.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, maybe Nigel, this is what you need to do. And so in the end, I gave 4 years of my life to working on this project, and a lot of help from you and some other friends of Chicks. For two real reasons. I mean, partly it's a labor of love. I was fond of this guy. He could be very frustrating. He was complicated. Oh boy, look at the ego and all that. But he was a friend, and he was complicated. And now, how does one say this? I mean, I'm a U.S. citizen. I lived in the States for almost 30 years. Americans like their heroes simple. And Chick Koop was not simple.
Yeah.
And that's my one-line explanation why no one had taken this on. So I thought maybe I should.
Yeah, and I think you have something you deal with in the book very well that's completely true that I know about intimately. And that is that, as you say in your book, he kind of had a falling out with the religious right, who briefly proclaimed him as a hero because my father was a hero to them. And they made this project together called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, a book and film series. And the film series, I wrote and directed the screenplays and then directed it and produced it. And briefly, Dr. Koop was going to be, or Chick Koop, as we called him, an evangelical right-wing figure with Francis Schaeffer and with these other TV evangelists and others for a few minutes. He was one of our guys. But the thing is, Koop, as you know, because you have this in the book, was a very independently minded person who, and I guess this will be the first point I raise about your book that's so fascinating because you document it so well. He came at the abortion issue in a unique way that did not fit either the Roman Catholic approach or the evangelical Protestant approach because, and I know this will sound odd to people, it was non-political. It was based on the fact that as a surgeon, he had spent his life saving babies, including premature babies. He was one of the first surgeons to operate on premature babies that were considered inoperable. His span as a surgeon goes from that time frame, and it offended him that babies were being aborted at an age when in other circumstances he could have saved their life if they had been born. And so for him it was a kind of a visceral reaction. And then later, because he approached it as a doctor and a scientist and a clinician, not as a politician and not as a preacher. Again, this is in your book. He had a falling out with the pro-life movement, evangelical and Catholic, because as Surgeon General, he kind of had the idea that a good president has, and that is, hey, I represent all the people now. So he was great on AIDS. He fought for gay people. He fought for AIDS treatment, irrespective of whether, as a Christian, he believed that homosexual activity was good or whatever. He saw these things as two separate things. I'm everybody's Surgeon General. These people need care. I'm going to help care for them. And he did the same thing with women, in that there were studies published by the pro-life folks on the right that it increased breast cancer if you had an abortion, or you were going to be super depressed. And Koop refused to take those positions because he said there's no scientific basis in this. And then you quote, and I'll ask you about this, um, a talk he gives at Wheaton College, the evangelical school, in which he lists, I believe, if I remember right from the book, 4 mistakes he thinks that the anti-abortion movement has made. And I'd like you to talk about that, because from that point on, he and the pro-lifers, as it were, parted company, because he was not ideologically driven enough. So why don't you, that's a point you can go into in some depth, and also talk about that talk he gave.
Yeah, it's really very interesting looking at the way he came into the abortion debate and the way he then somewhat backed out of it. Because, I mean, he was fired up about this. You're right. He was incensed because of the premature babies. Yeah. And he said, these little babies, if you go over the road, University of Pennsylvania Hospital, they're aborting babies of the same age as the ones I'm spending my life saving. And this is absurd. And then he got into arguments, and he made some traditional, pro-life arguments. But one of his basic arguments was, what about a week before? What about a week before? And so on. And so he sort of backed his way into this debate. And he was horrified back in 1973 that evangelical Protestants, among whom he was a leading sort of lay figure, were not interested. Most of them said, hey, this is the Catholic stuff. It's like contraception. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Now, there were exceptions, but that was the general view. People now find this very hard to believe, but that was the general view in 1973. Absolutely. So he goes, by chance or by providence, as he would have said, Wheaton College, which is the Harvard of the evangelical world, very fine academic institution, invites him to be commencement speaker in 1973. I mean, how could this be? Amazing. Because his daughter is graduating and he's a well-known physician. Why you get invited to do these things? They want your money and they want your name and they give you a degree and all that.
Yeah.
And he absolutely pounds the pulpit there with this very, very powerful talk against abortion and against all it will mean for killing hand-up babies, killing old folk, and so on. And it's the argument you're familiar with. He was putting this together back in 1973. Now, interestingly, of course, Wheaton was horrified by it. They didn't publish it. They were sort of, this was cringeworthy for them. This was not the position being taken by the evangelical world. And he's helped to change that. Now, you fast forward through his time as Surgeon General, through his experience of being obviously at the heart of what became the evangelical pro-life movement, and then moving out of it because he thought there were other issues to be dealing, other pro-life issues. That he was pro-life after birth as well as before, but one way of capturing it.
Yeah.
And then he goes back to Wheaton. And now, the only copy of his Wheaton speech in 1973 is in the archives at Wheaton. Nobody published the whole thing. The only copy of the speech he made at Wheaton after he stood down, which hasn't got a date on it, it's obviously early 90s, is also in the archives at Wheaton. I mean, I got these things. No one else has got them.
Yeah.
And he is making some very critical comments about pro-life. And so he's saying, for example, it's too politicized. This is basically a moral issue. Yes, it has political implications, but that's not the point. It's too extreme. And obviously, there have been some cases of violence against doctors and so on and so forth. He said it's sort of preoccupied with wanting 100% of everything.
Yes.
And he says, you won't get 100%. Maybe you can get 97%. Why haven't the pro-life and pro-choice people sat down and said, well, let's look at ways in which we can discourage, unintended pregnancies?
Yeah.
And obviously, one of the answers is contraception, which a lot of the pro-life would not have gone for. So he begins to this, and I don't think he's entirely consistent. I don't think Koop was often not consistent. This didn't worry him at all. It was part of his ego-driven thing. But he begins to map out, I think, a much more sophisticated position, which would have been very critical of the position he was taking back when he was working with you and your dad on the movie. And he would still say he was pro-life, but he stopped making speeches. And he specifically declined to get involved in various pro-life political type activities in his later years. And his friends criticized him for this and were quite sad about it. But I mean, he'd moved on. He'd probably have said he'd more moved up
Yes.
because he was then responsible for, even after being in office, all sorts of wider conversations in the culture about life, which he thought were perhaps more important. And he did say, when he was in office, he says, look, if I focus on abortion, I will have zero credibility in any other discussions I get
Yeah,
involved in.
exactly.
And that's a pretty smart thing to say.
Well, and he was the voice that got the US turned around on AIDS research and treatment because he was an advocate for the AIDS suffering community, wherever they came from, before it was a thing to do. So he had these kind of things that you would not think the same person would do that. And I think your book makes such a great point. I'm so glad you did this. And that is, people always misunderstood Koop in the sense that they were trying to put him in a framework other than being a physician that cared about his patient. And if you were gay and dying of AIDS, he cared about you because you were a patient as Surgeon General. If you were, a baby that had just gotten aborted, then he identified with that baby as a potential patient of his, and this shouldn't happen to my patients. And I think one thing that was really that I discovered about Chick Coop living at the Philadelphia Children's Hospital for about 6 months, rather, I lived in the Hilton Hotel across from it, but going in every day, um, he was such an interesting character because you talk about his ego. He had a massive ego, and my father did too. And the clashes they had on the set of Whatever Happened to the Human Race were amazing. I mean, they went through weeks of anger with each other, not speaking to each other based on whose name would come first on the book, and just nonsense. And I had to negotiate all this as the producer. I felt like I was running a rock band, that this was between these guys. And I was a kid, I was in my mid 20s, and here are these old guys, and I'm trying to get them to sit down and talk and so forth. On the other hand, I really got to know Dr. Koop on a level that I wouldn't have seen if I hadn't been with him in the hospital. And that is, he was very tough on the administrators and other doctors and anybody he thought was not representing patients well. But I sat with him when he met with parents of incredibly ill children. And I've never seen a gentler or kinder or more empathetic man. He had infinite patience for frightened parents and infinite kindness for children. He was a completely different man. So if you were a resident and you were operating on the table, with him, and you did something wrong or he didn't think you were paying attention, he was tough. Walk out of that operating theater and talk to a weeping mother. And if he had to sit with her the rest of the afternoon, he did. I mean, he was the kindest man I ever met when it came to the least of these, if you want to put it in biblical terms, and those he served as a physician. And the other people he took such good care of wasn't the doctors, it was his nurses, because his OR staff, his hand-picked up nurses, God help you if you were a smart-ass young doctor or a surgeon in there who misspoke or treated them with anything but the utmost respect, because he knew that his ability as a surgeon depended completely on these stellar, mostly women, who worked with him. So in his hierarchy, the patient came first. He would sit there and hold a child, like a grandparent on his lap while talking to a mother who was upset for however long it took. After that came his nurse staff that he treated like gold. Not a hint of misogyny, not a hint of bullying, nothing. When it came to residents and other doctors and administrators, he would tear your head off. And I fell into the category between all of those. Sometimes I was sort of like a patient because I was helping him with this project. But there were times when, he basically threw me out of his office if we were disagreeing on a shooting schedule thing or whose name came first on the credits. One last personal thing about Dr. Koop. He was a loyal friend. When I bailed from the evangelical community by writing a novel called Portofino that then evangelicals disliked, and Christianity Today tore apart because they said it was disloyal to my parents and so forth, because I was leaving, who calls out of the blue when no one else is calling? In fact, from the evangelical leadership that I knew well and was hobnobbing with, sharing platforms with when I was this hot young kid in the evangelical thing before I bailed. After I left, Dr. Koop would say, don't pay any attention to them. They're all idiots. And he'd call me. And when my wife, Jeannie, 10 years after we had been working together, had some big gynecological problems that ended up with a hysterectomy, It was Dr. Koop who called her and gave her the name of his good friend at the Mayo Clinic, who he sent her to see. Um, this was the kind of guy he was. So I have such fond memories of him, and he was the most prickly son of a bitch I've ever met in my life. And I probably am fonder of Dr. Koop than anybody else that I can remember that I worked with, period, which is an odd way to put it, but there you go.
Yeah, it wasn't just his positions that were, varied, but his personality was very, very complicated.
Yeah,
And he had this incredible, I think there's a wonderful quote I have in the book from the president of the Institute of Medicine, who
yeah,
says that the reason why he was the finest pediatric surgeon in the United States, because absolutely nothing would take precedence over the good of the child.
yeah,
Absolutely nothing.
yeah,
And there's some wonderful stories. I mean, again, I have it. Greg Easterbrook, who wrote this little piece about Koop earlier on, has this marvelous story which he let me quote about Koop visiting at home a child who was dying and dying slowly, and he went up to her room to visit her, and he came downstairs and sat on the couch, and her mother says he was weeping,
yeah,
and he sat there and he wept, and he was weeping and saying, "Why is it taking her so long to die?" Now, this
yeah.
is not a typical doc,
No,
at all.
no,
He is capable of having this extraordinarily empathetic relationship with the patients and with their families. And
yeah,
of course, they get it. And this draws them in, which is why even when things go wrong, they still think he's a wonderful guy. And
yeah,
because they know he's been there in it with them. And I
yeah,
think it's part of his Christian view of the world. That this is what we need to do with people who are suffering. And yes, he also had other sides to him.
yeah,
I think also, and of course, when you come to the AIDS issue, which really was quite extraordinary, and that finally the administration back in 85 said, okay, let the Surgeon General get involved and develop some AIDS policy, having basically skirted the issue. Um, and they assumed that he was, yes, he's a
yeah,
reliable social conservative. He'll say, well, just don't do these things, bad drug people, bad gay people. And of course, he doesn't do this, and it's down with the gay leaders. And I've spoken to the two or three key leaders from then, who were young guys then, and now sort of professors and so on. And they said, we really couldn't believe it. We thought he was being polite to us. He was going through the motions. He was saying, well, of course, I want to hear what you think too. And then we realized. And his friend Harold O.J. Brown,
yeah,
Joe Brown, whom you will learn, who was an old friend of mine, very conservative theologian, brilliant man, sadly died young of cancer. But Joe was very critical of him. I mean, he thought he really should have tried harder on the pro-life front and so on.
yeah,
But Joe said it was very hard for him because he came face to face with people who were suffering.
yes,
And the only way he could handle this situation was to suffer with them.
yeah.
And that is an extraordinary thing to say about a guy who had the ego that Koop had.
Yeah, and the ego didn't apply to those people, and the thing is, he was not typical of his either his faith or the stereotypical egotistical man, because his favorite person in the hospital was Dr. Louise Stauffer, who was a surgeon who was all of 4'3" or something and had to have a ladder built so she could stand next to the operating table. And he was the one who had promoted her. And this is back, this is way before it's a cool thing to crash the glass ceiling. All the people in his life he got on best with were the nurses in the OR, Dr. Louise Stauffer, and other people like her, so that he broke the rules. He was supposed to be this pro-life leader, but the thing is, he had too much sympathy on a human level for women to just write them all off as murderesses because they were having abortion. And that's where he got into hot water, because he didn't see the pro-life movement as strictly political. He saw it as reaching out and helping the patient, who is both the pregnant woman and the baby. How do we make this work? How can we save them both? And that was Dr. Koop all the way down. So I read your book with great joy because that personality comes through. Plus, you get the complexity of them. And then you have people like Harold O.J. Brown, who was a student of my father's at the Brief for a time, and we knew him as well. He loved Dr. Koop, but then Dr. Koop, I guess you'd put it this way, he wasn't harsh enough in the sense that he wasn't doctrinaire and political enough in his pro-life activity. He always had too much sympathy for all the people who were involved in these things. And then, you could reach him on that level so that when he, as Surgeon General, when he did sit down and talk with people from Planned Parenthood and so forth, they were always flabbergasted that he didn't come across as this hard-assed guy. Um, they had to sort of admit, oh, well, we kind of like him. And, he kept surprising people that way.
I think one way to frame his attitude was that he, if you like, his notion of being pro-life. I mean, life, of course, certainly in American parlance, has come
Yeah.
to mean anti-abortion, and that was certainly part of his position. Vigorously and very publicly earlier on, in a more sophisticated way later. But the point was, people came to realize he actually was pro-life. I mean, not anti-abortion. I mean, he was really very concerned of people who were already alive. He wanted to keep
Yes,
them
that's
alive,
right.
And
Yeah.
so when he sat down, with the leaders of the gay lesbian community, and he said, "Well, of course, I have my own views as to what you do," and he would call it sodomy. And one of his staff in the hospital, in the at HHS, I don't know whether I quote this because I think it was from a confidential interview, but I mean, she said he had a physical reaction to the notion of gay sex.
Yeah.
He found it nauseating.
Yeah.
But he was sitting with me and he said, "Look, God is the judge. I am a doctor.
Yeah,
My
exactly.
job is
Yeah.
to save your life." Now, the sort of the various movements, I mean, liberal, progressive, conservative, all these, they didn't know what to do about this. I mean,
They
this,
couldn't
this
deal with
didn't
that.
fit anybody's category. But it was Koop's category, and because he had this incredible personality and work ethic and ego, he was able to make this the position that drove the office of Surgeon General. And it was
Yeah.
an extraordinary achievement.
I'm talking with the author of Dr. Koop, The Many Lives of the Surgeon General. As I said in the introduction, this is an unusual book for me because not only am I in it, my dad is in it, Dr. Koop is in it, a lifelong friend of mine, and Nigel Cameron is the author. And it's a really terrific book. And I just, I know that sounds easy to say, but I happen to know that what you've written is true here, and you've done it so well. Let's turn the page on Dr. Koop for a second and go to another part of his life that I find very interesting. And that is that I think you would agree that before and since Dr. Koop, there hasn't been another Surgeon General who cut a public figure the way he did. I mean, I know we all sort of know the name of a Surgeon General and they'll say things about mental health or whatever. It isn't just because he was a friend of mine. There hasn't been any Surgeon General since Dr. Koop who was so much on the cusp of everything that's happening in a big way. I think I'm correct in saying that. And that got noticed at the time. I mean, he was on everything and in everything, and people would talk about him, and he was a very controversial figure. And almost the same thing happened to him as happened to Robert Bork, whose hearings derailed his getting into the Supreme Court as a justice. The left and the liberal, led by Ted Kennedy, tried to do the same thing to Dr. Koop because of his, quote, pro-life stand, but they failed because he came off as someone who, I think, in personal conversations and as a physician, and also his expertise as a person of science and medicine. Um, you don't specifically address this in the book, but it was hard to derail C. Everett Koop, and he became this big figure.
Well, it's curious. I mean, obviously, the subtitle of the book is about the Surgeon General because that is what he's known for.
Yeah.
But there's a sense in which his having the office of Surgeon General was almost incidental to what was
Yes,
going on.
exactly. Yeah, he was bigger than
Because,
the
I
office.
mean,
Yeah.
a lot of people do not know. So until the mid 1960s,
Yeah.
the Surgeon General was an extraordinarily important government official
Yeah.
because FDA, CDC, NIH all reported to the Surgeon General. It was a
Yeah.
huge job by the federal government, billions, hundreds of programs, and so on. And under LBJ, under Johnson, there was a decision taken to remove all these programs from the Surgeon General. So he would basically have a little office and make occasional speeches.
Hmm.
That's pretty much what it boiled down to. And so after the mid 60s, the job is a sort of title floating out there that doesn't mean much.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a bit of a footnote, but this is why I think Reagan appointed him. The
Sure.
Reagan administration was not full of people like Koop, or it was not full of people who were heavy social conservatives. There were some there. There were a lot of mainstream Republicans. But he was pro-life people were pushing for him to get the job because of his anti-abortion stance. And the Reagan people thought, well, he can't do a lot of damage. He can just make speeches. He's not running all these federal programs. And that's why he got the job. But the job itself had almost disappeared.
Yeah, exactly.
There really wasn't much to do. He had to sign an annual report on smoking, which he didn't even write.
Yeah.
And that was the only actual statutory responsibility he had, except a vague role as the commander of the Commission Corps, who are
Yeah.
these public health officers who wear uniform, which is a completely secondary story. But so, I mean, he gets his job when he's first offered it. I mean, talked to about it back the year before the, for back previous year during the election campaign. He thinks he'll be in the cabinet. Well,
Yeah.
it's never been in the cabinet. Um, and at the point at which he was given it, even the Marine Hospital, which he would have been responsible for, were being sold off. I mean, this job was cut way, way back. So what Koop does is to take this barely there job
Yeah.
and
This
turn it
symbolic.
into this incredible political thing. And
Yeah.
so, there's apparently back in the late 80s, he was the best known public official in Washington after the president.
Yeah, he was. And the
I
thing
mean,
is, he decided to make it his own. And so he was the spear point of the anti-smoking campaign. He was the spear point of, and this is where evangelicals totally parted company with him, let alone Roman Catholics, of telling everybody to use condoms and have safe sex during the AIDS epidemic. And he was the spear point of reaching out to the gay community with real research and saying, we were going to find a way to cure this when other people weren't talking about it. And we happened to interview someone called Melanie Brooks in a book called A Hard Silence. And yes, I have a point here. And Melanie talks about Schaeffer Koop in her book because her father got AIDS from a blood transfusion in Canada and was an evangelical Christian surgeon himself and had her and the rest of the family keep it quiet for 20 years because he knew in his evangelical Christian community there would be rumors and whispers, and he didn't catch it through gay activity, but he caught it. He knew the antipathy towards the community that had AIDS. She writes about Koop in the book as what it meant to her father as an AIDS sufferer, to have this man who was also a Christian standing up compassionately for the AIDS suffering community and spearheading the research in the sense of pushing for it and talking honestly about condom use and so forth. She actually talks about Koop in her book as one of their family heroes because he was taking away the stigma by again seeing these people as his patients. So it's odd because I was already thinking of your book. I interviewed her after you interviewed me.
mm-hmm.
And as soon as I read her book, I thought, oh, Nigel will like this because it fits in with you.
Yes, he had this capacity to engage, and I think picking up your point about how he engaged with patients,
Yeah.
and I think you see this in all of his engagement with people in these disease communities. And one of the, he because he had almost no power as
Yeah.
Surgeon General. I mean, almost no power at all.
Yeah, exactly.
He could make speeches, and he could make quite clever speeches, so he can attack the tobacco companies and really change the relationship between the government and the tobacco industry just by making a speech.
Yeah, he did.
And then, of course, he has the AIDS report, which it's just a report. He's not telling anyone to do anything. He's just coming up with advice and saying what he thinks. And his street cred kept growing.
Yeah.
And one of the rather wonderful things about the story is that during the 9 months before he was confirmed, when everybody was fighting about this guy, the New York Times was writing editorials, Dr. Unqualified, another
Calling
smarter.
him a clinician, the greatest pediatric surgeon alive at that time, and they're
Yeah,
dismissing him and belittling him. And by the way, I've never recovered from hating the left-wing American media from that because I knew Koop personally and I haven't forgiven them.
It was pretty nasty. And then one guy, smart aleck journalist, called him Dr. Kook, which stuck.
Yeah.
Although in researching the book, I discovered there are quite a lot of guys in the States who are actually called Dr. Kook.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But I mean, but the thing is, this made him famous.
It did make him famous.
I mean, back when he was not when he was first approached. I mean, people like you and pediatric surgeons all knew who he was.
Yeah.
But the New York Times readership all knew who he was before they'd finished beating him up.
Yeah.
And so he was already a major public figure, even if he was an unpopular one.
Yeah.
And then he goes after big tobacco.
Yeah.
And he says after he attacked big tobacco, full of 3 months after he was confirmed in February of 82, he said the press were on his side on every issue.
Yeah.
Now, it wasn't all hunky-dory. The Office of Surgeon General, he suddenly made his bully pulpit. Partly for that reason, no president since has allowed anyone to use that office as something other than a pretty small piece of the apparatus. And of course, they've been fired and this, that, and the other. And of course, we have this new guy coming in now. Let's not go there for now. But I mean, they would never allow. And of course, Koop wanted to carry on, or perhaps even become Secretary of Health and Human Services. But but that that was not what the incoming Bush people wanted at all. This unguided missile.
Well, and the thing is with Reagan, who appointed him, Reagan had no idea what he had just bitten off, because the thing is, Koop didn't care if this was a symbolic office. He wasn't symbolic, and he was going to use it to do good for his patients, people who die of cancer because they smoke all their life. We're going to stop that right now. People who didn't use condoms to have sex and now they have AIDS. Okay, we're going to do something about that. They didn't see him coming. And of course, it's doubly ironic with Reagan, because Reagan was pro-choice. And the only reason he nominated Koop is a sop to these evangelicals who voted for him. And then Koop could have just disappeared and never shown up again. And of course, he wasn't having any of that. Let me just reintroduce this a second here. I'm in conversation with my guest, Nigel Cameron, who's written this fantastic book, Dr. Koop, The Many Lives of the Surgeon General. Here it is. It came out 3 days ago in the States. It's available everywhere. But ironically, you're sitting in France and haven't gotten your copy yet, which is a first. So I'm waving it around and saying, buy the book.
Good. I've seen the front cover, but I haven't seen the side. So it's nice to have a view.
Yeah, you've read it, I think, because you wrote it, and I'm in the book, and my dad's in the book, and so forth. So Nigel's a writer, a historian, an ethicist, and a fellow at the University of Ottawa's Institute for Science and Society and Policy, and is the author of this book, Dr. Koop, The Many Faces of the Surgeon General. And this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And this book, by the way, is our July Has to Be Read book club offering, and comes with my 100% guarantee of a good read, but in addition to which, as I said a moment ago, and I'll say it again, and then we'll get on to some more questions. Weirdly, this book is literally ripped from the headlines, must read, because, of course, without understanding who Dr. Koop was, and incidentally, who my father, Francis Schaeffer, was in our project, and who this character was, who takes on big tobacco and so forth and so on, but also is known because of his stand on abortion, the election of Donald Trump would be inexplicable 50 years later, as it were, however long it was, because without the pro-life, anti-abortion movement, you don't have a politicized Republican Party. And I want to go back to that point, because you went through it, and I've tried to tell people this before, so I'm going to tell my version and then let you riff on it a little bit. People, when they looked at our project, Dr. Koop's project and my project and my dad's, whatever happened to the human race, in hindsight, people think that somehow we were talking to the choir, that we were talking to evangelicals who were already in this. But as you pointed out, with his Wheaton speech within Wheaton College, buried in the archive and never published, they were so shocked by his pro-life ardor. Similarly, when we came out with our series, and Dr. Koop and I came out with our series, when we had gone around the country doing my dad's art and culture series called How Should We Then Live, we played to full houses. We packed out Madison Square Gardens. We packed out the Grand Ole Opry. But Dad was at the height of his things. We came back 4 or 5 years later with this project. We were talking, if we could fill the front row of the same place we had been in 5 years before, and Dad was still popular, his books were still selling, but the pro-life message was vastly unpopular. Billy Graham, the evangelist, was not pro-life. He was pro-choice. Dr. Criswell from the First Baptist in Dallas, who was head of the Southern Baptist Convention, was pro-choice. People have no idea how co-opted the evangelical movement became in being politicized into what they had regarded as a Catholic issue, and a minor one at that. And so the very shift within our culture to this highly politicized group of people who were ardently anti-abortion to the point that it became the litmus test. If you roll the clock back 50 years, it would have been unthinkable to us as we were playing to these empty, venues, in the same way that Dr. Koop's talk at Wheaton College wasn't even published. And evangelical, nobody, that's an orphan that has no parent, because evangelicals don't want to admit that they changed their minds and suddenly became politicized when this was nothing to do with evangelical theology. And of course, the left doesn't want to look at this either, because they are in the business of demonizing right-wing evangelicals who have always been terrible people in their view. And so they don't want to know that there was this whole sort of central group of very staid, sensible evangelicals who were not particularly exercised about any culture war issue. And it just doesn't fit. So I know you know about all this because you just talked about it, and the book alludes to this. Maybe you want to comment a little more from your point of view on just how that happened, because I don't think people understand how big a change that was.
Yeah, it was an enormous change. I mean, certainly, partly religiously, in that, of course, evangelical Christians tended not to vote, and more of them were pulled into voting,
Yeah,
as very deliberately back in the 70s and into the 80s. I mean, Republican strategists. The Republican Party was the minority party,
yeah,
and they were looking for ways to change that. And one of the ways they got into this was social issues and
right.
things like obviously gay issue, gay marriage being on the horizon, and so on and so forth. Although Obama was against gay marriage first time around. I mean, these changes have been quite remarkable. But at the time, these were hot issues.
Yes,
And abortion coming, how can we get these conservative Protestants, on our side? Well, of course, the fact that they weren't particularly pro-life at that time anyway was a sort of double problem.
yeah,
But the Republican strategists were working at this, and I have a brief little book, and I look at some of the history of what was happening in the GOP, because they were looking to energize and politicize social issues that were
yes,
of concern to conservative Christians, conservative Protestants particularly. And they were very successful in this process. And of course, in the end, they were too successful, and they ended
yeah,
up taking over the party, and we are where we are now, with the more naive and politicized end of these conservative Christians basically running the show.
yeah,
Um, but at the time, they were looking for ways to change the situation. And of course, project that you and your dad and Koop came up with was innocently. I mean, this wasn't what they were trying to do. You were trying to do,
yes,
but it was part of this whole movement, and it was then used and used and used. And the thing about Koop is he absolutely hated being used.
yes, he did.
This was partly his intuition. It was partly his ego. But I mean, he was not going to be used by these politicos. I think it's actually Joe Brown. Howard J. Brown says somewhere very reflectively that Koop was very suspicious of politics. I mean,
Mm,
he contributed the occasional $100 to the GOP, but that was his commitment involvement in politics back in Philadelphia. He was
yeah,
not a political animal. Very suspicious of it. And he really saw his appointment, far from being this great trophy for the pro-life movement, as a kind of promotion into being a top public health doctor. And he
yeah,
really, he really believed that. I don't think he
yeah,
ever really understood American politics in the
yeah,
way that you and I would understand it. But they were trying hard to look for issues like this
hmm,
and to politicize them so that they would drive conservative Protestants into voting in the first place, because the voting they were way below the general population. What was a third were voting rather than half the general population, and
yeah,
then into voting GOP. And I think it's in the late 80s before we actually get a distinction in voting intentions on the abortion issue
yeah,
between the
that's right.
Republicans. And of course, you have a lot of Democrats who were pro-life at the time, and the Catholics were naturally Democrats for all sorts of other reasons. It was a very different scenario,
Yeah,
but the efforts that these politicos were making were remarkably successful.
yeah,
And
they
what
were.
what the pro-life people were trying to do for ethical reasons, they turned into a very powerful political movement.
Yeah, and very cynically too. And I knew some of those guys. I want to go to a little bit of a different tack and throw an idea out to you and just see how you respond to it. It seems to me, and this is dangerous territory in saying what someone would think now, but I can speak with some certainty about my father, and I think very much for Dr. Koop as well, that they would see the trajectory today with Trump in the White House doing what he's doing, and the kind of person he is in terms of character issues and the sorts of people he's working with. I think at this point, Chick Coop and I could sit down over a drink. And by the way, he had some of the most powerful liqueurs I've ever had in my life because he traveled to Poland and places, and they gave him these insane drinks that were completely crystal clear, and made from something or other. And, he would sort of amuse himself by saying, try some of this. And then, you'd pick yourself up off the ground. But anyway, this is a serious point I'd like to get your opinion on. It seems to me that Chick would agree with the following scenario. He was abused, and so was my father, by Republican operatives who saw, and right-wing conservative operatives who were far to the right of the evangelical movement at that time. They saw abortion as a useful issue, and they used it in the way you're talking about. The result was that the evangelical base became politicized in a way that in the 50s and 60s and in the early 70s would have been completely unfathomable to them on this issue. It became a litmus test. The result of that was that if you fast forward into the Trump era, from my dad's point of view and Koop's point of view, and this is where I want your response, and I know, Chick Koop would, I think, feel this way. He would say that the group that has suffered most from this is the evangelical witness to Christ himself, because Koop was a real Christian. He believed. He lost a son to a mountain climbing accident. He wrote a book, Sometimes Mountains Move. He was a predestinational Calvinist Christian who believed everything is in God's hands and it will all work out in the end correctly. This is all part of God's will. And he lived it in the way he treated people. I think of everybody I've ever met in my life, Dr. Koop would be more horrified by the fact that the Trump movement has a lot of members in it who have turned themselves into kind of a non-Christian, even anti-Christian cult, where they now are following and seeking political power rather than being witnesses to Christ. Because whatever Koop did, for a parent or a suffering child, somewhere in his mind, and I know this is true because he would tell me this was his Christian witness. This is how you follow Jesus, is by how you treated people. So, for instance, cutting funding to the NIH and the people who will die of cancer because of this, getting rid of foreign aid, these sorts of things would literally make him throw up, because it would go so counter to everything he believed in terms of how you follow Jesus. So I think, what happened is we helped politicize the evangelical movement. They then absorbed the Republican Party. Trump came along and turned the whole thing on its head. And now you have a very politicized group of people who barely even try to behave like people who followed, in Koop's point of view, would be following Jesus. And so it comes full circle and ends up so below the standard that he held himself to in terms of how he treated people. I think he would be shocked. That's my opinion. And I don't know, whether you think of that scenario has some validity to it, not just with Dr. Koop, but in general. I mean, how do you see this? Because you're a student of history. I mean, what the hell's happening?
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, like Chick Koop, I mean, I'm a conservative Presbyterian, maybe not quite as conservative as he was on a lot of issues, but I'm in that tradition.
Yeah.
And I think he would have seen this as an unbelievable caricature of what we really ought to be doing.
Yeah.
And as you say, I mean, things like strapping USAID, and of course, crucially within that, PEPFAR. Now, people maybe do not know this. PEPFAR, PEPFAR, was a program for AIDS relief, primarily in Africa, in which
Yes.
the US has had bipartisan engagement. This was set up by George W. Bush, conservative. Mike Gerson, who's now sadly passed, who was his key person on a lot of these things. Mike wrote, without what Koop did on it, he cannot see how they could possibly have got the GOP to support this huge initiative, which has saved millions and millions of lives in Africa, and which has now just been tossed out the window by the economy. I think Koop would have seen this as a caricature, and of course, perhaps also as sort of the inevitable consequence of the kind of radical politicization of ethical issues. I mean, politics is about ethics, and you can vote on your principles, but turning your principles into this kind of distorted political agenda, I think he would have been profoundly horrified. And it is sad just to say, as you say, and as I would say, no Koop, no Trump. Now, historical causality is very complicated. There are various other no this, no Trumps, but it's certainly the case that he was played, and that his issues, which were profound moral issues, were played by the politicos into helping build this political movement, which in caricature is now operating on the global stage.
Yeah, and it's so interesting you say no Koop, no Trump, because some people would say, well, no Francis Schaeffer, no Trump, and or no Frank Schaeffer's movie. But as you have a whole section in your book, no Koop, no Frank Schaeffer making this movie, no Francis Schaeffer making this movie. Dad was never going to make a movie on abortion. Koop talked him into it via me. He
Yep.
was very clever. He talked the young son who
Your
needed,
dad, he had the brand, he had the megaphone,
he had the brand and he had the
and he had
megaphone.
you, and it all came together rather beautifully.
It came together, and as Koop would have put it, the sovereignty of God once again brought it all together. But the thing is, he talked Dad into having the last two episodes of How Should We Then Live allude to abortion as the and the takeover of the courts as the kind of imperial judiciary. He said use that as the example because they were talking. Then he came to me and said, "Here, I have a really great idea. Let's sit in your living room down in the chalet you're living in the basement of with your parents as a young married man with a young child," and mapped out on the back of a bunch of envelopes all the episodes and said, "Let's do this." And I talked Dad into it, and 6 months later we were in production. So Dr. Koop not only is the hinge of evangelicals becoming part of the anti-abortion movement, he's the guy that talks Frank and Francis Schaeffer into throwing their lot in with him. And then he gives some credibility to the movement to the extent which he actually is pro-life, as you say, because he's not a rotter, he's a good guy, and he's applying the same pro-life ethic to the living. He cares for AIDS patients. He's anti-tobacco. He takes on the tobacco industry. So, he's one of these rare people who, whether you agree or disagree with him, he was absolutely consistent in the way he stood up on things. And
Yeah. Well, one of
anyway,
the just remarkable things that I think a lot of people don't know, and I only briefly in the book because it's only so much space there. But he set up this series of things called workshops while he was Surgeon General to
yeah,
address other issues. And so, for example, he's been credited with making domestic abuse a public health issue
yeah, he did.
because he has this workshop. He pulls the public health people into it. He did a workshop on drunken driving as a public health issue. He
Yeah,
really built a whole agenda for public health, which was really radical and certainly not traditionally conservative at all
yeah,
because of his pro life commitment. He was
yeah,
a doctor. God is the judge. I'm going to save your life. And it took him all over the place.
yeah, yeah. And he followed that wherever it led him, including staying friends with me after I was radically unpopular with evangelicals and calling up and saying, "How's Jeannie?" Finding out that she, had been having all sorts of gynecology problems. He says, "Oh, I'll help you," and this is that, and I'll make some calls for you. And he did. Next thing I know, she's talking to the best people at Mayo Clinic. Uh, I mean, this was Dr. Koop, and it wasn't because she was my wife. This is how he treated people he knew. Again, for a woman, because to him, wife abuse was a public health issue and we ought to do something about it. And, he was a refreshing kind of a guy. And people will enjoy getting to know Dr. Koop in your book, Dr. Koop, The Many Lives of the Surgeon General. It's our book club offering in July. And eventually your copy will find its way to you in France, where you are sitting right now. Sorry that I have mine first. And I think the University of Massachusetts published it, didn't it?
University of Massachusetts Press, yes, they published quite a few biographies. I've been very delighted to work with them. It would have been a lot more fun, of course, to get one of the New York publishers and get a big advance and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. But it's a serious book, but I think it's also readable. And there are even
It's
pictures.
very readable. It's beautifully written. And again, just watching how you transcribed some of our conversations and the notes you used from that, and Harold Brown and these names of people that I do know. Of course, there are a lot of people in his life I didn't know, but obviously I zeroed in on the bits that I was familiar with from personal experience. And you've done an incredible job. And I can just say to anybody out there, who's interested in why we're in the situation we're in, and actual American history told by someone who knows what they're talking about, who can write beautifully and draw you in. This is the book. If you want to know where the mess we're in now, but also it's a very positive book in another way, because not everybody who's ever been a conservative on any issue is part of MAGA conspiracy Trump world. Dr. Koop would hate this moment. He would once again be at odds with all the evangelical voices. J.D. Vance would be cursing him up and down. Tucker Carlson would call him who knows what. he would have an exact understanding of who Vladimir Putin is, if you know what I'm saying. So he was not at all. So if anybody wants to read a book where a beautifully written book about a prickly character who was on the surface conservative, but underneath was a real human being of the kind that was terrifically compassionate and wonderful, Koop's the guy. And so, like Dr. Koop, your book in a way sort of breaks the stereotypical approach to people. In other words, you do the opposite of what the New York Times did with him. You really look at him and you're saying, no, sorry, you can't just say he's conservative and, there's a lot more to him. And so your book is very, very important, and it's a terrific contribution to American history and just to our present moment. When you started this book, of course, Trump had already come on the scene, but I don't think you could have foreseen the fact that you've written a book that's actually kind of at the crossroads of our moment we're in, because it really shows him to be who he is in a way that, will confound simpleton right-wing MAGA people, but will also confound the liberals who think they understand conservatives and can just write them off without considering them. I mean, give you the last word on that, but that's how I see it.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that this is one reason I think why biography is important. Yes, you can read stuff about people in the New York Times, okay, and you can chat with your friends and you can find websites and so on. But if you want to understand somebody properly, it's going to take you a few hundred pages. It's going to take you someone who spent years of their life digging around. And one thing I did with the book, the final chapter, which is a kind of personal assessment of Koop, it's a very delicate sort of thing. I got half a dozen of his best friends to read it and to give me, those were closest to him, not family, those who were closest to him in his final years, and to give me their honest reflection. And we pooled it. And, it takes a lot to understand somebody.
Yes.
And I've sought to do that in a way that, of course, makes him extraordinarily relevant to all that is taking place now. But I think we can learn a lot from people's lives. And I think biography is really important. And I think we tend to have these very naive snippet kind of views of public figures. And I learned an awful lot writing this book, and also made a lot of new friends, including, for example, his widow Cora. He got remarried when he was 93.
Sure. I know, crazy guy. Yeah.
And getting into his life, and I think I'd like to feel he's coming back to life. This is what happens when you write a biography. It's a way of bringing the dead back.
Yes.
So maybe he's in glory, but he's also back here in Washington on this earth, telling us what medicine is really all about and telling us how to cope with politics.
Yeah, I love it. And again, you've written a book about a true human being, not a one-dimensional caricature, and that's an enormous favor, but also a figure that, historians and anyone who wants to understand the moment, and journalists and students and others and political activists ignore at their peril, because Dr. Koop is one of those hinges of history without whom you cannot understand the present. I mean, literally. So anyway, thank you very much. And I'm going to ring off here as if this was a phone call. So I'm not ringing off. It's a podcast, but I'm going to end the call here. But please stay on for a moment and talk to my producer, Ernie, for a second after I go away, so that you can do two things. First of all, that we can properly arrange with you to promote the book with any way, any links you want to it and so forth. And secondly, if you have any ideas on other people we ought to be talking to about any subject whatsoever, we're always up for another guest name or two and suggestions, whether it's on this subject or anything else. But listen, let me just say again, Dr. Koop, The Many Lives of the Surgeon General. This is a book about a friend of mine, a very complicated, wonderful person. If you think it's a good thing that less people smoke cigarettes today, you can thank this guy. If you think it's a good thing that domestic violence against women became a health issue, this is the man that kicked it open. If you think AIDS research and helping millions of people survive a plague is good, thank Dr. Koop. And if you are horrified by what happened to the anti-abortion movement, you can also, sadly, credit Dr. Koop, but not the way you think you can, because he's not a right-wing villain. He's an interesting guy. And a friend of mine. So anyway, this has been great. I love the book, Nigel. I can't thank you enough for writing it.